Hey, this is Sean here. Going to cover the story of the Banksy shredding artwork.
Okay, it's the Banksy girl with balloon, ladies and gentlemen, standing in the back of the room. And I'm going to start getting in 100, 150, 200,000. I have already 200,000, 300,000, 350, 400,000. Now, 400,000, 600,000. Your bid's got 600,000. Anyone else? Last chance. And selling for 860,000. Yeah, if you could maybe get one of the technicians quickly to go and take them over there, that'd be great. Quickly, okay, we're moving on, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to move on here. Sorry if I have your attention.
So, a lot of people were kind of surprised. So, what happened was this work from a private collector, which considering private could be anyone, but considering this artwork had to have a battery to operate, I would assume it was sold by probably Banksy himself or through his gallery, so to remain anonymous, or some friend to help him sell it so that the battery would be fresh, obviously, to get to work. This was the girl with the balloon. So it came in at about 200,000, and supposedly that was the worth at the time. And then it went up through the auction and it was the last lot. So which I assume either Soethbys was in on it, but based on the expressions on their face, it didn't look like they were in on it. Basically, it was at the very end, so obviously they generate the enthusiasm and keep all the buyers to the end. So I would assume, Soethbys put it at the end just to maintain all the buyers there, because people get bored after they buy what they buy, but obviously people want to stick around to see where the Banksy lands, right? So it's a really smart tactic from Soethbys to try to raise the price and keep people there and have the most amount of buyers. So basically what happened was, right as they bid up, as soon as they hit the auction block, the picture literally starts shredding itself. It goes zzz, and it about half shreds, right? Now some people will say, why didn't you shred the whole thing, or why didn't you shred it? It probably just broke down, like it only had a battery life for only half, or maybe Banksy intended it to do it this way. Who knows? Anyway, so the question is this a criminal act or not? Because basically Soethbys is out from the 200 price coming in to the 1.4 going out, so they're on the hook for $1.2 million, which they have insurance for these kind of things, but I don't know if they have insurance for self-destructing artwork. So that's kind of an interesting quandary, right? Obviously, it'll garner much more interest in Banksy's work, so it's self-propagating for Banksy's part, as well as it's kind of a great joke in the sense that a lot of artworks, when they are bought initially from the first buy that the artist actually gets paid, they might get a few $100s, a couple $1,000s. Maybe if they're famous, they get $10,000, $20,000, and then someone sits on it for 10, 20 years. And the second, third buyer, they make all these great jumps, and then the artist doesn't get anything on the subsequent sales. So it's kind of outrageous, right? But that's how the art world works, right? So has any of this been done before? So Banksy's been known to do various types of art pranks. So one of his earliest one was of cows. So he got into this farm. No one ever done graffiti, graffiti in the countryside, right? No one's out there. And so he went and he got in his farmer's land and he spray painted some cows, like wild style and Banksy kind of stuff. So as Banksy points out in his book Wall and Peace, this is actually very dangerous because a lot of farmers have shotguns or rifles. And if they're drunk and they come out and they see someone damaging their property, which would be the cows, like, yeah, you could have been shot. So that's a little more dangerous than your typical street art in the city. From there, he went on and did various types of street art, and he kept scaling it up. One of the most infamous ones was recently he got into a battle with Mr. Robo. So Mr. Robo was this graffiti artist in the 80s, and he had done All City, which is basically spray painting your name everywhere in the city, but Mr. Robo didn't know where to go from there. So he's like, well, I want to kind of sit down, have kids and have a normal family life. So he gave up graffiti completely. And so all his pieces slowly got painted until his last one, which was right underneath the police station, which was very hard to get to. And Banksy, slightly tagged it and then included a new piece right next to Mr. Robo's like final, really hard to do piece because it's right next to the police, right? So at that point, Mr. Robo, he got so pissed off. He's like, "What the hell, dude? You're gonna insult me? I was the all city before." And Banksy was basically somewhat all city, but this guy was the real true all city. So it's basically going over an OG, right? So Mr. Robo starts tagging and brutalizing all of Banksy stuff, and then Banksy obviously tears up Mr. Robo's work, and they have this kind of battle in the street. And then a couple of months go by, and obviously Mr. Robo's probably 10 years older than Banksy's. Banksy's probably in his 30s, so this guy's in his 40s, probably my age. And he wakes up clubbed in the middle of a sewer, so it's kind of like, maybe he got clubbed by some bum, some guys, some hoodlums out in the middle of nowhere, or maybe Banksy knocked him over the head, right? It's hard to say. Hopefully not. But you never know. Street art, you're playing the dangerous side, and a lot of people get killed for their art, usually because they fall from buildings. Yeah, accidents happen in street art. Another thing Banksy did to egg this on is he started posting his art inside of museums illegally. So he went to several famous, like the Tate in the UK, and quite other few all in the UK, and he would super glue his work right to the wall, boom, like this. And the first couple ones fell off in a couple hours, so they were kind of a disaster. But then once he figured out the glue, he snuck them in there in a bag and glued them to the wall, and they last for a couple weeks, right? And he snuck in rats inside these boxes in the natural history. He took in a block of stone with this kind of shopping cart with a caveman. So that was kind of a funny. So he did all these museum stunts, right? So he started building up his name for that way, because no one had ever really, I think, probably they had happened before, but not to this level where he really just made it part of his art pranks as part of his thing. Well, before Disneyland, he did an LA show, and it was really outrageous. He had like an elephant, like a real elephant inside his art show, and the elephant was spray painted like a Louis Vuitton purse, so it was really kind of funny and clever. And then later he kind of launches the career of Mr. Brainwash, which in one story they actually suggest that Mr. Brainwash is Banksy, but I kind of find that hard to believe. And Mr. Brainwash lives in LA, and his stuff's kind of like Banksy, but it's kind of cheap version. It's not really good. Banksy keeps making high quality Banksy work. I mean, Banksy could have done Terry Gooda's work, obviously, but I don't know if he'd stoop to that level, just because he could have, but to be in two different places at once doesn't really make sense. I would really think that he actually does live in UK, and it's just kind of, since people don't know who he is, it's just this nice gimmick that people can speculate on. Oh, is he this person? Is he that person? Is he living here? Is this a conspiracy? And this always happens when you have secrets, so that's really the genius behind keeping these secrets, and then people speculate, and you got the word of mouth versus trying to hype yourself on Twitter and social media and all this stuff he doesn't really use. He just uses Instagram a little bit. So after the LA show, he blows up Mr. Brainwash, and then he comes back. This is about the same time frame, and he goes to Disneyland, and he has this idea. This is during the Bush year, and a lot of street artists are against Bush, especially with the torture in Guantanamo and this crazy wars in Iraq that no one agreed with, right? Obviously, everyone thought Saddam Hussein was a bad guy, but thought they just made up the charges on Saddam as far as the chemical weapons, and they don't show up, and then you're like, and now we're torturing people, and they don't even have the weapons of mass destruction. So he puts up, they pay to go to Disneyland, right? And then they bring in a blow-up doll, and they have it in a bag, and they blow it up, and they jump over the fence over one of the rides, and then they hang this jumpsuit with orange that look like the Guantanamo prisoners, and he hang them by a rope, and he hangs them off of one of the Disney rides right next to the ride, and the ride goes back once, it goes back a second time, then stops. Banksy and Mr. Robot, they split ways, go different ways. Mr. Brainwash has the footage, and Banksy's gone. Now Banksy doesn't know what happens to Mr. Brainwash, and Mr. Brainwash actually gets caught by the Disney police, right? So they interrogate him, all this stuff. Eventually it turns out, Terry had, I think he snuck the footage into these little chips, and he put it into a sock, and he took this other chip, he had switched it right in front of him, they didn't realize, and he said, look, I'm going to wipe this out, boom, bzzz. There's nothing, right? So then the Disney police, what are they going to do? They don't have any footage. It looks like they've lost everything. They don't have anything. So he had to let Terry go. So Terry was able to go through this whole police procedure, which is kind of comical for them. And he got away with it. It's private property. They can only use really, the Disney police, they haven't really done anything except for kind of trespass and use the park in a way that they obviously didn't want to use it. So that was another really big Banksy prank. There's speculation that Mr. Brainwash's show was staged by Banksy. Hard to say. It might have just been Mr. Brainwash learned how to copy Banksy, hanging around Banksy and hanging around Shepard Fairey. So who's to say? Mr. Brainwash is kind of like cheesy. It does kind of look like Banksy, but it doesn't have any of the. It doesn't have any of the artistic merit, I would say. It's definitely fun work, so I think that's why people like it. Anyway, so then he did Disneyland in UK, so that was really interesting. Kind of did this Disneyland, and he brought in all these other artists, and he had probably a few works himself, but mostly other artists. And it's just kind of this tongue-in-cheek, really take on Disneyland. He says, "Oh, it's not about Disneyland, but it's called Disneyland, right?" They have no Mickey Mouse, but it's obviously kind of a ripoff on Disneyland, how they're kind of coming to Europe and making the Disneyland in Europe, and that was a disaster. But it's this fake world that it's a small world after all, and they're really like just harping on that. Like, this is total crap, right? That's not the reality of the world. So he did Disneyland. That's kind of fun. Then he recently went to New York. He did a New York show, and he went and spray painted all over New York, and he was there 30 days straight. And he got this 1-800 number, and he had to dial in, beep 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 beep, and for each work you could dial in and find out what the description was. And the police were going nuts because New York, they're really aggressive anti-graffiti. They're chasing all over. They couldn't find Banksy, and he got the hell out of the country, and they never caught him, right? So it was this hilarious prank on the police. As well, he's gone to Palestine. He's painted Palestine on the wall, which more serious, I would say. That's not really an art prank, because he could have been shot by the guard towers, as he states in his book. So the other question: do you think the gallery that sold this was complicit, or do you think it was just Banksy behind it? I personally would think that Banksy, posed through a friend or posed through his gallery straight to Soethbys, because there's no way you could have a battery that lasts 3 years, right? It just had to be a work that was put together pretty recently within a 6-month, a year period, and then you put it to the list, send it to Soethbys. I'm kind of surprised that Soethbys didn't figure out, but the thing is, Soethbys, in the interest to just make a quick turnaround, so they're probably not as always thorough with the work, and as long as you could access the work, like take it apart and get to the print, and then you had this heavy frame, as long as there wasn't anything like jangly with it, then maybe they didn't know. So hard to say. On the expression on their face, it looks like it's pretty honest. Now, do you think the value of the art increased on this? I would say yes. Obviously, it's a half destroyed work, but it's been one of the first artworks that's been pranked, live in Soethbys in the auction house. He did do some smaller pranks within Soethbys before, so this is just up his alley as far as you're riding that level of between, legality, illegality. Basically, he's breaking all the principles of what people think art should be. So it's really, I'd say that's pretty genius to break all these assumptions. Now, my question is you, how would you top this prank? I don't know, you can do the same prank again, but the thing is, it's been done once. The first time is the charm. So, there's been other ones, like I think there was some artists where they actually took all their belongings and then they just trashed them. I'm just like, I thought of this myself. I thought of maybe taking a painting and burning it on the camera, but it's so hard to burn your own work, But this was a copy. There was multiple copies of this girl with the balloon, so I wouldn't feel attached to work that has multiple copies, right? And you already done the work in the street, so this is just a copy of the original. The original in the street is what's really valuable, and then that's been lost over time, or it's been chopped up. He doesn't want this being chopped up, but it does. So it is an interesting thing with his work. Historical pranks that have been really interesting have been Marcel Duchamp with the famous Armut, and he did a urinal and he put it on its side, and he called it Fountain, right? And obviously it was rejected, but it was one of the greatest art pranks of all times. So it's quite frequently. There was also, I think, de Kooning. One of his drawings was erased, I think, by Dali. I'm not sure, or maybe it was Jasper Johns. I don't remember quite who it was, but one of his drawings was erased, and the erased one was the artwork. So that's kind of funny, but it's kind of like you lost a work just to prove a point. I don't know. But if you have a lot of work out there in the art world, like, do you need more, or is it one less loss? I don't know. If it's like, obviously you wouldn't do that with a Vermeer. There's only maybe 14 of those. So that would be really bad. Another really cool thing when Banksy snuck in artwork into the museum is he would he would buy works that were historical but lesser value, and then he would redo it and put, you know, modern graffiti or something in the artwork and then put it into the museum. So it was really fun. But basically, let me know if you think this is a crime, and hope you like my story. Thanks for watching, guys. If you want to subscribe below, and I'll see you on the next fake news.